Okay, question for Mr. Pearce. In what way did mobilization for the Great Wars influence the conditions you detailed or accelerate them, especially the surrender of power to federal levels from local democracy? World War I and II, even the Civil War. And as a follow-up question, are there examples, either modern or classical, of societies that have rolled back the federal encroachment on democracy after becoming accustomed to that encroachment?
Great questions. Well, the first thing, that war, generally speaking, is something which is used by big government to become bigger. Within the present dynamic we have now, the two dynamics towards big government are the socialism of the Democrats and the neoconservative imperialism of Republicans. And if that's quite controversial, so be it. So, but basically, big armies, big military means and needs big government, not least because it means big taxes, right? So, World War I don't know much about American history. Right, so obviously the war between the states, more controversy in Kansas, but the war between the states, obviously that it did consolidate. One consequence of it, regardless of what side we're on in that conflict, it did consolidate power in the federal government, as that's obvious. And the munitions industry during both world wars obviously also ended up concentrating power in the central government. So war, generally speaking, is not good for freedom. Although we fight most of our wars claiming that it is. Here's Joseph Pearce, the pacifist. Joseph Pearceifist, maybe. And what the other thing? Turning things back again. Yes, lots of times. Well, the most recent time of centralized power being rolled back towards decentralization is the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, Soviet Union, and its empire, Eastern Europe. In other words, what was effectively one empire, the Soviet Union, and a dozen or so satellite countries are now all independent to one degree or another. Some of them have surrendered their sovereignty to the European Union. But the point is, yes, it does happen. It's not that this inexorable process and progress, so-called, towards global government, one world government, is not anything guaranteed. It's about the will of us, right? What we do about it, and the desire for freedom. So. I think there's hope.
Sean, you got anything on this one? Yeah, looks like we do. I got a follow-up for Mr. Pearce. Question from a gentleman earlier that I was visiting with. He asked, considering the imperative that we have for corporal works of mercy, feeding the hungry, for example, hasn't the industrialization and centralization of agriculture, including the use of GMOs, genetically modified organisms, hasn't that helped us to feed, for example, the poor of the third world? How do we square that, if that's true? Do you grant that it's true? If you do, how do we square that with this kind of approach of staying small and local?
Another good question. Well, first of all, something I didn't get a chance to talk about during my talk is something which is called appropriate or sustainable development. And global corporations like Monsanto basically try to make the third world countries slaves of their own product. They sell products that you can't replant. You just keep buying the seeds every year. Let me give you a practical example. It's not about GMOs. Give you a practical example of sustainable development. A typical modern third world aid would be macro organizations like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, with the biggest players in terms of government, USA, UK, etc., European Union. And they would provide, should we say, several $billion to build a nuclear power station on the outskirts of Delhi in India as aid. A consequence of that is that the impoverished villages, the menfolk leave the villages, especially bearing in mind all that we've said about family, the menfolk leave the villages, leaving their wife and children, and they end up living in these hideous shanty towns, shanty suburbs on the edge of the big cities to build this nuclear power station. It's disruptive of the culture and life of the country. Most of that development money goes into the hands of the government of the country, except for those actually working on the plant. Same amount of money could actually put solar energy in every village in India. All right, but the World Bank and the IMF don't want that because they actually want to control. Making self-sustainable villages all over India actually frees those populations from the whole globalist thing. So the IMF, World Bank, big governments around the country are not going to give money to actually to finance sustainable development. They want to finance development which puts the third world countries in their pocket.
Any other thoughts there? Okay. Thank you. Question for Dr. Cuddeback. Here we go. Believing we were forming our marriage on traditional, godly terms, my husband and I divided all the household duties along gender lines and have inhabited separate spheres ever since. How can we be intentional about our household together? And a parenthetical note, we are a couple without children.
That's a beautiful question. I'm gonna quote Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry says, in the traditional household, there was a distinction between the roles of man and woman without there being a division. This is a very, very important notion. I think the caricature of the traditional view of the roles of man and woman, the caricature is actually more a phenomenon of industrialization, which is, as Pastor Pearce just pointed out, industrialization tends to be more what will take a husband remotely from the household and leave a woman at home alone. So this is I'm very fascinated with this whole topic. In brief, I think what a lot of people in our own conservative communities think of as the traditional family is actually this kind of 1940s, 1950s model, which is not really a healthy model of just husband being breadwinner that goes somewhere out there, and then the woman is left with all these duties at home, and that's what Wendell Berry means by the division. Whereas in a traditional household, there's a distinction going all the way back to Xenophon. He speaks in terms of it's hard to capture, but he uses the notion of kind of inside and outside. The woman's duties are more hearth-oriented, more interior, and the husband's duties are a little more active, a little more exterior. But the key thing there is, first of all, they're two parts of what is clearly a one project. Whereas in the industrial family model, the husband, while he does bring the money back, his work is actually completely remote and completely distinct. It's not part of the project. And so the husband tends to be abstracted, often then even from the project of raising the children, comes home from out there so tired, and the woman is left with a whole host of things. In this division, she's worn down, and this leads to great problems. So the answer has got to be in being able to preserve. I know it still comes down to the details, but at least we know this is what we're looking for. How can you set it up so that it's clear that you're working together, you're in the same thing, more different parts that very much overlap. And I think even in the traditional model, husband sometimes in the kitchen, woman sometimes out in the field, and just kind of the old agricultural model. How can we do that now? Have as much while retaining real differences between man and woman, a distinction of roles? How much can they overlap and really be seen as working together on one thing?
Others? Okay, thank you, Carl. Question for Father Check. How do we explain the relationship between modesty and in dress? How do we explain the relationship between modesty in dress and chastity to practicing Catholics who, the question says, who do not have a clue? So how do we explain the relationship between modesty in dress and chastity to, to folks where it's not in their imagination already?
I think I already broke the microphone. St. Thomas describes modesty, I think, as the garden around purity and chastity. So it's one of the things that helps to foster the virtue. It's not the virtue itself. How to explain that? Increasingly, this is a difficulty because the standards for dress are such that the idiom and the understanding of modesty has been lost. I think it's worth noting here, to quote C.S. Lewis again, that not every person who's dressed immodestly has the intention to foster unchaste thoughts in someone else. They just may be inconsiderate or thoughtless about what they're doing, or they just may not be aware of it. So we don't want to automatically connect certain forms of attire with the intention to seduce. It may not be there, especially, I would say, probably in younger girls. But the recovery of that is going to be a difficult work, and it's going to be something that takes place in families, not unlike the ones that are represented here, where there's a way of expressing a kind of style or aesthetic in dress that doesn't look, what's the Thomistic term? Frumpy? I don't know. And I mean that with a smile. Frumpy does, right? So there is a way, it seems to me, to be attentive and thoughtful about what the way we present ourselves without falling into one of two places. The strongest teacher here in this way is going to be example, and that's why young children, young girls look at things that they see that Taylor Swift and others are wearing, and they want to imitate them. So what the parents do, particularly the mother or the older siblings do, the older sisters do, is they model something that is attractive, feminine. And for the boys, I think it's probably avoiding kind of sloppiness and carelessness with regard to their attire. So I think the power of example, but I'm happy to hear my colleagues on this, they have some ideas.
Just a real quick thought that just to add an end on the Father's great answer. Something that fathers often have to work with daughters, and I know the question was about explaining it to other people out there, but I hope maybe perhaps it still could be a help. Sometimes this has to be done in an age-appropriate way. When do you start to share certain things with young ladies? But obviously part of this problem is for at some point ladies to recognize something that is at times hard for them to recognize, that is that men tend to objectivize them. And so I do think it's a helpful category to say there's a way of dressing that's a way of respecting yourself, and that does not invite men to objectivize you. And I think sometimes, particularly with younger ladies, I'm thinking a father often is the one that can and should step in and help her understand this is how you respect yourself, and you invite other people to respect you too through your dress. Just a quick
follow-up, Bob?
I can't improve on perfection.
Okay, this is probably for anyone who wants to take it. It's a big, broad question. To cultivate a love for poetry, where does one start? Yeah.
Well, hopefully, you have a good love of poetry, you don't have to do anything. You're conceived. So the rhythm of the heart that the child hears is its introduction to poetry. So that the first, in a way, the first communication that a child hears, and we know, because the reaction of children once they're born, that they do hear and think about that sound, and they can identify the rhythm of the mother's heartbeat. So humans are conceived into poetry. Literally, they're born into a rhythmic language that has a kind of regularity that is, by virtue of the mother's carrying the child, is 9 months of metrical instruction. After that, one hopes that the household itself has a graded introduction to poetry and song, where you're simply hearing songs and nursery rhymes. And most children I know naturally move into verse and songs and communicate this way. I remember when I read The Lord of the Rings the first time, I remember thinking, this is interesting how often elves and even men, dwarves, how these creatures are communicating immediately in song. Certain things are related in song. And that struck me, of course, in the 1970s, or probably the mid to late 70s, as odd, because in my world I'm not hearing a lot of poetry. But then, as a father observing my children, I didn't have to read Brooks and Warren to get this point. Children just naturally communicate in song. They conceive and express their human experiences poetically before they do, certainly before they do in any other form. Now, if you're an adult and you're trying to become introduced, now we're in the realm of what do you want? You pick something that, you pick an author who is writing on subject material you like, first of all, just to make life easy. That's hard enough. Just pick poetry you like and ignore anyone who says, this is a really meaty poet, you have to read these poets. We can move to that later. The single best, in my view, the single best introduction to poetry for someone who decides, I kind of like poetry. I wish I understood why I like it, how I should appreciate it, is Brooks and Warren's Understanding Poetry. It's the single best introduction to the purpose of poetry and imaginative literature, as one of the best 18 pages written on literature, period, as its introduction. And it's an excellent book for self-study, because it's both an anthology, a commentary, and graded questions and commentary. So it's not, see this point from which you should conclude this. Instead, it introduces certain points, and then the questions don't necessarily have answers. There's no answer key. They're to provoke a response to what about the human condition is being communicated through the imagery, the meter, the tone, the attitude of the poet, etc. That's where I would recommend, if you were talking about a rational application, I want to come up with my own program of study, Brooks and Warren, Understanding Poetry.
Excellent. Follow up. Okay.
Just 10 seconds before I pass to Professor Pearce.
Great.
Aristotle says philosophy begins in wonder, and I think it's also true to say that poetry begins in wonder. In the best natural promoter of wonder is the natural world. And so I think being out there among the beautiful natural things is cultivating poetry.
I just enjoy disagreeing with Dr. Fahey. No, actually, I don't. I do enjoy it, but I can't find any real reason to disagree. No, everything that Dr. Fahey said, I agree with. The one thing I would just add, just adding to it, not disagreeing with any of it, is that poetry is very, very important, and it's actually it ties in with Professor Cuddeback's point, is that that humility allows us to see reality, to contemplate reality, and that leads to the dilatatio, the dilation of the soul. Poetry is the singular way in terms of literature that allows us to do that. Some things really can only adequately be expressed in poetry. So if you find yourself in a beautiful landscape watching the sunrise, there's only one way of adequately expressing that, and that's in poetry, not prose. Prose doesn't do it justice. Poetry doesn't, but it gets closer to it. And the other beautiful thing about poetry is it forces us to slow down. In that sense, it actually parallels what prayer does. I mean, obviously prayer does more than this, right? But one thing that prayer does is it slows us down. It takes us out of the distractions of our life, most of which, or many of those things, are not necessarily good for us. It grounds us, it actually roots us. So the whole idea of poetry is something just airy, fairy, and up in the air, complete opposite. It allows us to reconnect with the primal things, with the important things, to step outside the distractions into reality.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, let's see, where are we? Oh, Dr. Fahey, a question. I don't have it written down, so I'm just going to see if I can remember it. You made the distinction between the liberal arts and the servile arts. Where does music come into play? The study of music, also the creation of music. Does it occupy some kind of bridge or transitional area between the two? Where do we put music? How do we think of it?
Well, music is enumerated as one of the 7 liberal arts.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, what's meant by music there is not what we normally mean by music. It's more about measurement in time and space. Still, good music participates in measuring things in time and space, and so I suppose it could be a bridge between the idea of craft and the more intellectual things in the quadrivium. So yeah, I mean, yes, I affirm the answer that was supplied in the question. It is a bridge. And I am most limited and damaged in my youth by the inability to sing or play an instrument. And it's one of the things that I've never been able to overcome. I can sing poorly, and I do, and I've tried the harmonica and a little recorder and other things like that. But I have trouble speaking much about music just because I don't have the direct experience about it. Okay. Cowards. I'll take geography for 500, please.
All right, Father Chad. What is the difference between joy and happiness, if there is one? What is the difference between joy and happiness, if there is one?
Never deny, rarely affirm, always distinguish, St. Thomas. I think in the context in which I was using the terms and thinking in the context of the gospel, my understanding of joy would be something that is substantial, lasting, and reaches deeply into the human heart, and ultimately, because of grace, unites us to the heart of Christ. So when Jesus says, I have told you these things that my joy may be in you and joy may be complete, he is thinking in expressing something that we cannot achieve on our own and only through created means and goods, but something that is particularly of God. That is not to say that there's something wrong with human happiness. and that happiness is an invalid category, and that we are not grateful for the moments in which we are happy. A gathering such as this does much, I think, to promote at a human level the idea of happiness. But what will last and what will transcend particular moments will be something more substantial. Now let me just flesh this a little bit more at one point. If you think of the fourth joyful mystery of the Rosary, the presentation of the child Jesus in the temple, it is also the first of Our Lady's 7 sorrows. Why do I say that? Because in that same moment, Simeon expresses his joy that he holds the Savior of the world in his arms, and that this moment for which he has been waiting for a long time has finally come, and his heart and soul is flooded with grace and joy. But even as he is giving us the Nunc Dimittis, the third gospel canticle, now let your servant go in peace, he is telling Our Lady that a sword will pierce her heart. So within that moment, both joy and sorrow are being expressed and in some measure experienced, as Our Lady anticipates what will come at Calvary. So the human heart has the capacity to warehouse both of these seemingly contradictory emotions together at the same time, joy and sorrow. Think of a person that you knew lived a holy life, an exemplary life, and has died. You miss that person. I can think of someone in my mind right now, and though I can't say for sure that that person went to heaven, I believe they lived a good and faithful life. I miss this man who was dearly important to me, but now I think he's achieved the purpose of his life. So I can hold those two things together. Happiness will be something that will be more passing. That doesn't mean it isn't good, but it's not going to have that same kind of staying power to it. So that's the distinction I would make. And I'm happy for my colleagues to correct or improve.
Okay, very good. This question comes from a young man who's in high school, just to give some context here. Question is, what is the value of the modern school system if it deprives a boy of his boyhood? How can we cope with this in our day and age if we have no other option than to attend these schools? How can we achieve this fruitful growth, boy and man? Pretty easy.
Yeah. Will you please stand up? Just kidding. How can you ask that? That's a great question. Obviously, this is complex, and honestly, a good thing that I invite you. I hope that you can, and that you will speak to your father, especially as you work through those things. It sounds like you already recognized in that question that you might not be able to opt out of something that is less than ideal, and that's often going to be the case. And so I'm going to invoke a point that I made in my lecture. There's a lot that can be achieved just by having a good intention. In another way I'd put it is sometimes just knowing you have a problem is 50% of solving it. Because if you're in a situation where you don't realize that you have a problem here, then you're going to be suffering under it and you won't be able to be counteracting it anyway. But if you realize that you're being put in a system, a situation, a school that's pushing you in a direction that you shouldn't be going, or is taking something away from you, then you can be making conscious efforts to try to do something else to counteract that. A well-posed question, but I don't think that even the school can take your boyhood from you. You can maintain your boyhood, especially with the help of your family. And the very fact that you're asking that question means that, I don't mean to go too personal, but I just want to say again, I'm going to go back to, I'm going to invite you to talk to your father, even if you think it's going to be difficult, because he might not know that you're suffering that, and just that you can work that through together. I tell you from the father's side, he wants to know that. And just by your being tuned in with one another, you having a stretch, a growing relationship with one another, you can overcome anything.
I echo all of that. My father, Chris's father, we were growing up, we did things with our father. He taught us something about merit. St. Thomas says something is more ours when we participate in receiving it. So my dad used to give us a kit from an old company in Benton Harbor, Michigan. It doesn't exist anymore, called Heathkit. We would get clocks and radios, and we'd build them together. And when we did that, each of the boys with that individually, we invested ourselves in a project with our father, and that is where that relationship grew and strengthened. Let me put in a plug for St. Joseph here, if I may. Let me say a couple things about St. Joseph. First of all, I think many of the depictions of St. Joseph are unfortunate. They show him collapsed over the baggage on the flight into Egypt, and he's already lost all of his hair at that point. That's not historical, it's not accurate, and it doesn't do anything to foster in the sense of a young man this remarkable figure in salvation history. First of all, the mistake I think was made probably by Baroque painters who felt they had to protect the chastity of marriage by making somebody very old and uninteresting like St. Joseph at 89 years old. That actually undermines Our Lady's sacrifice in her own chastity, because she would have made a sacrifice because Joseph was strong, young, and virile. So Joseph was the protector of the Immaculate Conception and the Christ child. In our seminary, we have a depiction of Joseph with a full head of hair, thankfully, and he's holding a saw or a lathe and not a lily. I know what the lily is for, I understand it, it's fine, it's been embedded in the tradition, but today for a young man it doesn't inspire anything. Because a man holding a flower doesn't look like a very masculine character. So let's find some pictures of Joseph. Joseph in the Litany of St. Joseph is called the foster father of Jesus. I think that's a mistake. He really should be called the virginal father. Why do I say that? Because foster fatherhood implies that there was a time when the child was not under the care of the parent. Husband and wife hold everything in common. So from the moment that Our Lady, that Jesus was conceived in the womb of Joseph, he was the virginal father. So foster father is not an accurate title, it seems to me. So I recommend praying the litany of Joseph, maybe with that a little qualification. Let me say one other thing about Joseph. Not that he needs my defense, but in his honor. I thought, well, this Joseph is a dear friend of mine and has been for many years, but I'm thinking of St. Joseph. Yeah, that's right. He doesn't need to be defended by me or anybody else. At the Annunciation of Joseph, the typical exegesis of that is that Joseph backs away out of misgivings. He's not certain what's happening there. And so he thinks, I need to be separated from this. That's not what Bernard of Clairvaux says. He says that Joseph backs away because he strikes his breast and says, Domine non subimus. Lord, I'm not worthy. Joseph is a just and righteous man. He knows the scriptures, he knows the prophecy, and he knows who's before him. He knows who Our Lady is. And he is going to step back and say, no, I can't do this. Until, through the angel, God the Father says, keep your post. So, a devotion to Joseph for a young man, a proper understanding of who this great saint is to us, can do a lot to make up what I agree is a lot of mischief that's going on in schools. I also agree with Dr. Cuddeback that fostering the moral imagination by reading good books about heroic men, the North American martyrs, Walter Chiswick, These sorts of things will do a lot to capture the imagination of the young boy and make up for clearly what's missing.
Just to add to that, as all previous two answers have actually centered on fatherhood, the only thing I would say is that we need to look at the school. I'm personally an advocate of either very good schools or homeschooling, right? That I went to a very bad secular school when I was growing up, high school. And most of the secular high schools out there are very bad. And I do think there's a sense in which the innocence of childhood is violated in some of these schools. So I do think that as parents, we do actually have to be hands-on as regards to sort of school that that our children are going to. And if we're in a situation where there aren't any good schools locally, we should look at the homeschooling option.
Do you know the age of this young man?
16-ish.
Okay. So that's important. I mean, when does boyhood end? Thank you. That's worth thinking about. The father's job one of his jobs is to make sure that your boyhood goes well and ends. And so the desire to preserve your boyhood could be a very good desire, but it isn't necessarily so. So I think the situation that's, with the limited description we have, is a wonderful moment that I think in most young men's lives come, and that's when there is either real, or more often than not, apparent opposition to the father. And that's a great opportunity to learn a lot about your father, and to make rich the last stages of boyhood and begin to enter into manhood. So I would suggest that the first thing is to consider, you can't ever allow ideal things to become the enemies of good things. And I'm 50, and I still struggle with this. So I come to occasions like this, and I'm elated, and then I know I will get on a plane tomorrow, and I will have to struggle with, on Monday I have to go in and proofread fundraising letters and prepare for this and that other necessary thing. Why can't it always be the great ideal of talking about founding schools and perfect cultures, etc.? So I'm sure all of us would agree, you shouldn't leave something like this with an idol of boyhood and then go away sad because you think you've been robbed of something. Instead, you should look at this awareness as a moment for getting to know your father and your father's intentions for you. And fathers aren't perfect, so you may be delivering a fantastic gift to him merely by asking some questions, and that allows the two of you to enter into a conversation. It's often late in the game that you realize the things that your father is directly and indirectly teaching you. And 16 is at the point where you begin to be bothered, and the tendency is to push back. And sometimes that's right, but I would urge you to be attentive to perhaps the things that your father may have given you. My father had a working life that would be almost a caricature of what Joseph Pearce and John Cuddeback, when they're talking about the problems of the industrial age, American society, everything that's wrong with it. He worked in business, very, very busy, and there were lots of things that I did or could have complained about. We didn't homeschool, had no idea what homeschooling was when I was growing up. But there were certain things that I wished I had commented on then that I'm very aware of now. So I grew up in a household where we didn't talk about Louis de Montfort. There was no family rosary. But it was the same routine every night when my father came back. He walked in, he took out his wallet, he put his wallet on the bureau, he took out his rosary, kissed his rosary, he blessed himself, and then he put it down on the bureau. My father and I never had a conversation about the rosary. I grew up never seeing my father without a rosary, never doubting that that should be part of a man's daily life. From the time of high school on, I have never not had a rosary in my pocket. My father taught that to me indirectly by his own actions, and I wish I had been more aware of it to ask him questions then about that. So I would encourage you to look at this as a crisis in the proper sense of that Greek word. It's an opportune moment for you, standing on the balance of boyhood and adulthood, to work with your father to make sure one phase ends richly and the other phase begins well. And perhaps you give a gift to your father that he's not expecting in your questions and concerns.
If I could follow up with a question I think is very closely related to that. The transition from boyhood to manhood is, when does that happen? It used to be in many traditional societies that there were certain rites of passage that marked that transition. We don't have those now. Why? And could we reclaim certain rites of passage? Are there some that we really do have, but we don't identify them? Can you just address that business of the rites of passage?
Yeah, I think that's a nice way of expressing it. So two distinctions, boyhood and childhood. So I think boyhood, the passage from boyhood to manhood would be marked by a series of rites of passages. And of course, we're in an age where it's dangerous to be a man. Everything that is a man is viewed with hostility, and the system is structured against masculinity and manhood. So the likelihood that there are going to be rites of passages to celebrate a boy's passage to manhood are slim to none in the general society. So we have to think about, what do those look like? How do we create them? And I would express it as those rites of passages should have something to do with a kind of mastership, display of mastership and craftsmanship. That's to say, the older members of a community or a family or a unit judge the younger one to have reached a certain level of maturity, and that dictates the rite of passage, not a calendar or anything like that. It has to have meaning. Those who already have earned it say to one who isn't sure but desires it, you have earned it, as much as one can. Childhood is different. On my father's side, when my grandfather died, and then a little more than a year later, my Nana died. And I remember at my Nana's funeral sitting with my father and saying to him, "How are you doing?" And he said, "That's an interesting question. I've been thinking about that a lot. And the thing that I keep coming to is, now my childhood is over." So I'm trying to think. I think my father was probably at that point in his mid-50s, right? Now my childhood is over. And then he sort of began to meditate out loud with me on what that meant. And it sort of meant, and I think he may have used this expression as well, I'm now the end of the line. So I'm the senior-most person. There is no living parent above me. There's no older brother. He was the oldest son. And so I could literally see the responsibility, not the sadness of his mother's passing, that was there too, the sort of responsibility, sensing that his childhood had ended. That's different than boyhood, which is, I think, a rite of passage.
I think there are rites of passage that exist culturally, but they're bad ones. They're in gangs, they're in sexual expression, and there are things that are actually contrary to the very virtues that we're interested in promoting among boys. Boys are made for hierarchies. They want them, and they want those rites of passage. Because, and I'm thinking back to my almost decade working in the Courage Apostolate in the field of homosexuality, that boys who are deprived of the steps into manhood don't all necessarily go down that path, but they're missing something that really is their right and their due in their nature, which is the approval and the confirmation of their manhood at a given level by the step that's above them. That's why we have the Boy Scouts, or we did have the Boy Scouts. As my friend Tony Estlin says, the Boy Scouts are in trouble when they're agnostic about what it means to be a boy. We used to have it in the sacristy, and maybe one of the best things you can do is encourage your parish priest to have only boys serving at the altar. Why is that important? Because that rite of passage that begins as a very young boy, probably even before he's made his first communion, when he is actually the boat boy, he's holding the boat for the thurible, for the thurifer, all the way up to when he becomes an MC or assistant MC, master of ceremonies. There are rites of passage there in the sacristy through which those boys travel. And having that confirmation that they've reached the next level by the boys who are already there is formative for their understanding who they are. And if we deprive them of that, they lose something about what it means to be a young man. So one place it can be recovered is in the sacristy. I will just say, I understand maybe it was a kind of generous-heartedness that suggested it was a good thing for girls to serve at the altar, but I think in the end it winds up hurting men. It's not supposed to be a male enclave, that's not the point of it. There is something there that, of course, that is an apprenticeship for the priesthood, which is important. But there's also something in that stepping stone in the development of a boy that takes place there. And so that's something that I would encourage.
Just very quickly, I don't mean this to be a plug for St. Martin's, but I just
Please go ahead.
This really is not, which begins by saying my son is at Gregory the Great Academy. I know, I'm just teasing you. And I'll just share this. That was a very big decision for our family, and I'm very respectful of different families or different places. I will say, my son is a senior, and Father mentions hierarchy. At Gregory the Great, when you're a senior, you're made a prefect in your room, and you're given a certain authority over other young men. And I'll just note that I don't know how I would have reproduced that experience with my son at home. And that has been a rite of passage without being too personal. I'm very proud of my son in what he's certainly not perfect, but he's going through a rite of passage by having to exercise a certain authority among other men. And it so happens it's at being at a fine boarding school where in a little community there, they're able to do something that I don't think I could have done in my household. And I'm not saying that's necessarily one size fits all, but I just note that because I think it's relevant to, we do need to be looking for such things, and that's an unexpected gift that I found.
Wonderful. You know what? I think we better draw this to a conclusion. Thank you all so very much.